It's June 12th, 2021, and welcome to episode 60 of the Babymetal podcast. We gather in the podcast Discord server on alternate weeks to discuss news and thoughts on the past and future projects of Babymetal. We invite you to join us, whether you're a longtime fan or have only just arrived. I am Paul, and I'm joined by Kevin.
Hey, welcome back, everybody.
And this week, a special guest, Stephen, maybe better known to everyone as FunnyToss. How are you?
Hello, everyone.
Hey, welcome. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
And Maggie couldn't be here this week, but she will be back. So.
Hello, Maggie from the Beyond.
So we have a little bit of recent news we can talk about, and then after that, we will turn to talking with FunnyToss about the process of translation. The translations that we've been covering recently have largely been his work along with Capable Paramedic, and so we'll talk a little bit about that once we get done with the news.
I suppose that was the end goal. That's why we've done all these episodes on translations.
That's right.
There was a plan.
Although there will be more episodes on translations.
Yes, there will. But we had a plan.
There are many, many translations. But okay, so let's see. There's not been a whole lot of news. We actually, in real time, it's only been a week since we recorded last. A couple of little things. One was that apparently the Tower Records is having a fundraiser, the Music Cross Aid Goods Festival, which is basically just a cross-artist merch festival, and Babymetal is participating in that.
Yeah, lots of Amuse artists are also participating. Sakugakuin's participating 1.5. I think I saw Perfume in there.
Oh, okay. But it's not Amuse only, right?
No. It is not Amuse only. It's Tower Records, but a lot of the Amuse artists have a pretty, or I guess Amuse in general, has a pretty good relationship with Tower Records. So that makes sense that a lot of their artists are participating in this.
So anyway, I think what you have to do is actually go to a Tower Records on like June 14th to June 30th. And
you do.
So probably most people who are listening to this in English are not going to be doing that, but at any rate.
Right. And don't feel left out. The merchandise is the same stuff they sold for the Budokan shows, or a smaller selection of it. So it is still available. You just don't get to contribute to a good cause if you buy it.
But the Budokan shows were originally online only, right? Like the merch could only be purchased online as opposed to in person.
Correct.
But for this one, the Tower Records thing, you can purchase it in person, right?
Yeah, you have to go to Tower to make your purchase.
Cool.
And I believe I think you walk out of the store with it. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. Also, what else? Leda turned 34. So happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Not sure what else to say about that.
It blows my mind that we're the same age.
Yeah. That does seem to me it doesn't seem very old. But
yeah, I was also looking up on a random note. I was looking up, I think, the ages of like some of the Babymetal songwriters. Mm-hmm. And I think who was it? Was it Yuyo Yuppei or whoever was like in their late, like mid-20s when they wrote like Make Itsune and stuff like that, which just blew my mind.
That's okay. You were just jumping out of airplanes when you were in your 20s.
I was actually already 30 at that point. Not very smart.
Okay.
You age quickly when you do that.
Yeah.
Yes, your knees don't thank you very much at all.
Let's see. And then I guess maybe the only other thing, and it's possible that there's more to talk about here, I'm not sure, is that in advance of the stream, the worldwide premiere stream, Babymetal has announced original stickers that you can use in the chat. These are chat stickers. Okay.
Neat. I don't quite understand what they are. I've seen a lot of debate about if they're merchandise or not, and if you have to buy them. Mm-hmm. I feel like if you had to buy them, they would have said, for 200 yen or whatever, you can buy the sticker pack to use on the stream. They don't say that anywhere. So I'm inclined to think they're just stickers you can use for fun during the show.
Yeah.
But I'm conflicted because there are like official stickers that you have to pay for on like Line, for example, which is why I'm not super sure. And it also seems contrary to what they've been doing lately, giving us something for free.
Yeah. I don't know. My reading of it was essentially that it was, just free. It's something that you can use it in this particular stream. So,
yeah, that's my interpretation as well. My crocodile brain expects to be taking advantage of a little bit more, I guess.
And you can sort of see, so there are 9 of them. And they, like some of them you can sort of see the use for. So, generally speaking, they're kind of like the one illustrations or whatever, so they've got a sort of a Mr. Bones there doing various things. And, so one sticker has the writing says Babymetal, and, so presumably that's for using during the We Are sections. And there's one where there's clapping. And several of these actually are organized into like sort of 2 simultaneous frames at once, so there's sort of two actions, so in the clapping one, there's like the arms spread out and then the arms together and little wind lines or whatever.
Right.
And then there are 2 that have whoa, whoa, whoa in the background, one with sort of like a flailing Mr. Bones there, and then just one open. And I assume that's, that would be, you'd use that probably for, I don't know what, distortion. I don't know what.
Maybe.
Yeah. So, but there's one, the headbang one, where the 2 frames one.
Oh my god.
The 2 frames setup went very badly.
How does this get out of QA? Be like, oh, this is fine. This is fine. It's my favorite sticker.
Because what it's, I don't want to describe it too much, but essentially it's just, it's upright and then sort of bowed forward.
And then,
but it's
upright.
It's in 2 frames. It's in 2 frames represented on the same sticker.
Yeah. Let's just say we don't want to risk getting demonetized on YouTube for describing it in detail.
Let's just say that I have no doubt that it will be the most popular one in the chat.
Yeah.
Anyway.
They knew what they were doing.
Or they didn't. I think it's funnier to think they did.
I do kind of think. This is also the same group that had a illustration with "This is not a fun club."
True.
So, and then the other stickers are like one's just a sort of like a logo. There are a couple of mask stickers, one with the Megitsune mask and one with just sort of like the sort of more modern mask that they have on all the magazine covers and stuff. And then there's sort of like a weird spirally fox, one that sort of is unrelated to anything we've ever seen before. So,
like a 10-tail fox.
Oh, is it 10? Of course it's 10. I hadn't counted, but of course it's 10.
It's 10. I counted because I was like, oh, did they rip off Pokemon and give us a 9-tails? But no, they did not.
Excellent. So, anyway, that's kind of where the news sits, I think. That sticker, though.
I'm just surprised there was anything at all in the last week.
That's true. I think that's been true for years. That even though it does seem like nothing's happening for long stretches of time, there's still like little trickles of stuff. Like there was never a month that went by when nothing happened at all.
Well, they've also started doing Instagram ads for the live broadcast, right?
Yeah, I have seen.
That's true. I didn't see that.
I haven't seen them myself, but they, I guess basically if you are an Instagram user, you might come across them. Probably if you're in Japan, probably not just.
Yeah. Part of it is that I'm already subscribed to their channel on Instagram, so I assume it's not going to show you that if you're already subscribed. But if you're not, you might see the ad.
That's disappointing, because the people who care are going to be the ones who are subscribed. But yeah,
well, time to unfollow.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I never seen the ad. I've only seen people posting screenshots of the ad.
Because I don't think it'd just be region dependent this time, just because it's an international stream for once in their life, right?
I wouldn't think so.
Yeah, maybe. I have no idea. I wonder how broadly that got out.
Yeah. Because, Instagram ads can definitely be region dependent. They can be very targeted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're, like 2 weeks out, I think. Yeah, actually, that's right, exactly, because
yes. Exactly 2 weeks.
Record on the day.
Oh, nice.
We have a plan.
Yeah.
Sometimes
All right.
We have a plan.
Well, it's possible that is as far as the news can be stretched. Unless, was there anything you wanted to say about the ads? Did you look at them? And
they're cool.
Right.
Yeah, that's about it.
Pretty much.
I think one is a silhouette of Sue on black, one's a silhouette of Moa on red, and the other one's a logo or something like that.
They're not moving images.
I haven't seen a moving image one. I've only seen a screenshot.
All right. Maybe now we can turn to actually talking to Stephen, who, as I said before, probably is best known to everyone listening as FunnyToss, who has collaborated with Capable Paramedic from the Reddit on a number of translations of recent articles and that sort of thing. And so we've talked a fair amount about translations, and the reason that we've had those translations to talk about is from the work of FunnyToss. So we thought it'd be good to bring him on and talk a little bit about kind of like the process and just his background, how he got here, how he found Babymetal, that kind of thing. So maybe we can sort of start there. What brought you to Babymetal in the first place?
I guess part of it is just, my interest in Japan, as is the case for many people. I think being a weeb isn't particularly uncommon or rare nowadays. But I guess I'll just start off with a basic intro and let people know how it goes. So as said earlier, my name is Steven, and I've been a Babymetal fan for about a year now. So I grew up in America, mostly Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I moved to Taiwan, where I am now later on in life. So when I was studying at the University of Michigan, I had the opportunity to study Japanese. And that included a half-a-year exchange program in Kyoto. So I've always been interested in like Japan-related stuff. And how I found Babymetal is, it's kind of a pretty straightforward story, actually, compared to some other people. I, learned about them through reaction videos. My gateway was the Fine Bros reaction video. I actually saw it a few years ago, I think. But again, like many others, I dismissed it as just a weird Japanese gimmick, until I stumbled across it again when I was stuck at home during the pandemic, earlier last year. And I decided this time to see if there's anything more than the weird stuff like Ine and Doki Doki Morning that was featured in that video. So I found karate, road resistance, and the rest of that was history. So yeah, I got into it, but it wasn't until later on that I started, deciding to try my hand at translating.
I did not realize you were comparatively a new fan. I thought you'd been around a little longer than that.
I'm 1 year. 1 year.
That's incredible. Yeah. So that means you haven't been to a live show.
Nope.
All of your consumption has been either buying stuff, downloading stuff, watching stuff online, etc.
Yeah, all of it online. I think part of that does motivate the translations, just because I know that the live shows are a big part of it, but I care a lot about the other aspects of it as well, partly because that's how I enjoy or consume the stuff from the band.
All that stuff about the ramen. Now, it applies to you if the first ramen you have is online.
It does. That's why the analogy made perfect sense to me immediately, whereas Paul was like, I don't understand that analogy. I'm like, it's
no
easy.
Kidding. So I want to take a break from your bio real quick, because we have a rare opportunity, because usually when we have somebody on, they've kind of been around for a while, right? How do you think your Babymetal journey has been different from somebody who's been around, forever, or has been to shows? What's your impression of the band, given that you've only known them really through the pandemic?
One thing that's true about that is like, you have not been through an album release. Like all of the albums that were released were already released, right?
Yes.
Right.
I think one way to put it is there's a difference between, let's say, watching a show in real time and then binge watching it, years later after it's already been completed, right? It's when, the experience you get is slightly different when you're watching, Game of Thrones, in real time, and then, a new episode comes out, right? And then you're talking about it on Facebook, on Twitter, on Reddit with people for an entire week before the next episode is released, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot more time and opportunities for speculation and arguments and hype and all that. Whereas when you're binge watching it, oftentimes by yourself, it's a different experience, for better and for worse, right? So
sure.
I think for me, when it comes to being a fan for only 1 year, I basically missed a lot of the stuff in real time, such as the so-called golden era or Yui's departure or the dark side and stuff like that. And so for me, yeah, all three albums already existed by the time I joined. And so I think that affects the way I perceive or I enjoy the albums, I think. I don't think there's any... I don't want to say that older fans must be biased towards the older albums because they were, released during their time. But I think it's easier for me to avoid such kind of a thing because all three are technically on equal ground for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement to make. People who've been around long are going to latch on to what brought them in, and if you've been around since the release of the first album, odds are that's going to be your favorite and you're going to look fondly upon that. That isn't really just apply with Babymetal. It applies with all kinds of things in life, right?
But that said, though, I think it does actually still apply to a certain extent to Babymetal because most of the publicly available stuff is actually from their earlier albums. Like, especially, last year when when they weren't cracking down so hard on reaction videos, most of the reaction videos are reactions to stuff on YouTube, right? And most of the stuff on YouTube is from the first and second album. There's very little material from their newer albums with the exception of Papaya or whatever. So, as I was watching most videos, my first exposure was still to the songs that they have official releases for, like, Road to Resistance and, Make It Sine, Ine, Doki Doki Morning. So basically, I'm still most familiar with the first album, despite the fact that all three albums were available when I joined, because the third album was, for some reason, not very well publicized for the most part. Yeah, at least on their official channels.
How has that shaped what your favorite content is or favorite member?
Oh boy.
No pressure.
I think when it comes to content, I think for me, if I'm going to rank like the overall favorite album, it would still be the first album. I think not just because that's the one I listened to first, just because I think for me, my particular taste, like, okay, so for reference, my favorite song is Make It Sine. And a big reason is I like the whole metal thing, which is a more, Western sounding thing. I like Japanese elements within metal. And I think Make It Sine helps to reflect that the most. And I also like the whole, kawaii and heavy metal contrast more. And there was more of that in the first, one, as, especially Yui and Moa were young. So I think I remember when the first time I listened to Metal Galaxy was, like someone put the entire album up on YouTube and I was listening to it casually, while I was at work because, once I got into the band, I started binge watching. So even at work, I was listening to it. And for me, Metal Galaxy at first, that'd be hard for people to believe now, considering how much I love it and how much I tell people how much it's awesome. But I didn't really like it that much the first time around. I think there's different. It's an album that can't really be enjoyed passively, or is not enjoyed very well audio only in comparison to some of the other songs. Because like Ine or like Make It Sine, some of the Ainote, the Sore is going to stand out to you immediately and draw your attention. Whereas something like Brand New Day or the stuff on Metal Galaxy is much more internally consistent.
Like this,
there's a big difference between songs, but each song in of itself is less, schizophrenic, jumping between genres like Ine. So it doesn't draw your attention as viscerally that quickly.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
So for me, I only came, grew into, I think, Metal Galaxy partly because of that. But I've enjoyed it, I think, more and more as time goes on.
If you started at Metal Galaxy and worked your way backwards, I think that would change. That you would have a different perception rather than, or as opposed to starting at the beginning and coming forward in time.
Yeah, well, and it also does seem like the idea that they had was to take the expectation and disassemble it and reassemble it, and of course, it doesn't work. In reverse.
Well, I think even though, like I said before, all three albums were available by the time I joined, because of the way the content is available publicly, that is, by public I mean not on Discord or not on a ProShot spreadsheet, you actually, I think many people still experience the band in a relatively chronological order. Because I think I was a fan for about maybe a month or so, or even almost 2 months by the time I actually thought or even knew about joining Discord or finding about the ProShot spreadsheet. Before that, it was all YouTube only. So basically, I'd already immersed myself within most of the earlier material. And, and also I was confused as hell about the whole Avengers thing and all that, because it was never very clearly explained officially.
Sure.
You don't understand that very much unless you're in a Discord or on Reddit threads or wherever. I had a hell of a time telling people apart, as I, first started and all that. So in that regard, though, the impression of Babymetal I had from the beginning was still, the original trio. Like, even though, yes, it was Metal Galaxy and all that, but most of the material available online is of the original trio. So that's what stuck with me, the most. But, as you get into the later albums, there is no Yui on Metal Galaxy and stuff like that. So I think when it comes to, I don't know. I always say that I appreciate, all the members equally. I know that's weak. That's a weak answer.
Nothing wrong with that.
But it's more that you can't really compare them per se, because they each have their strengths in different things. Like I said, Sue is the queen. She has something that makes you want to, I don't know, obey her or something like that. But Moa makes you smile like the most for some reason. You don't know why. And then Yui is like, the cutest. So in a way, they can't really be compared because they have different roles in the group. It's like comparing Bo to Omura, and like you can't really, besides saying they're all great.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. Very diplomatic of you.
It is. Well, I did study political science in college, so yeah.
Perfect.
Nice. Perfect. You nailed it.
But it is actually what I believe. I'm not, censoring myself for the crowd here, because it's not like, I don't have anything to lose here. Yeah.
No, I legitimately really do think that was a great answer.
Yeah, no, I think that I think conforms pretty well to the way I think about it too. Like it seems pointless to try to relatively measure people on scales that don't match up.
Yeah.
So I have one more thing I wanted to bring up kind of on your bio, but I'd rather spend more time on kind of getting into translation, because I think there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had there.
Sure.
You told us a little bit about how you got started learning Japanese, college, did the study abroad. What's been your language learning journey kind of through your life to this point? And I guess I need to ask what your first language is, because I'm not entirely sure.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, I guess this does go back to my bio. So I was born in the United States to Taiwanese parents. So my parents are both Taiwanese, and because my dad was getting his PhD at the University of Florida at the time, and he found a job in the States and settled down. So my mom says my first language was technically Mandarin Chinese, because that's what she spoke to me at home.
Okay.
But I always imagined myself as my first language being English, because I don't remember anything from when I was a baby, right? So, but she said, I didn't speak any English, when she tossed me into, a nursery school at like 2 years old or something like that. And then after 2 weeks, I could speak English or whatever. So, but yeah. So we were bilingual at home with Chinese and English. And like most, ABCs, or as we call American-born Chinese, most of us are more fluent in English than Chinese. How it goes is you often mostly speak English at school or wherever with your friends. And then but your parents will speak Mandarin or whatever home language there is at home. And sometimes, they'd speak to you in Chinese and you respond in English just out of habit, or you don't know the words, or you start mixing the two together. So I don't really consider myself to having really learned Chinese in the same way as other people learn a language, because you grow up with it, you just understand it, but you don't actually understand it very much. Like, you can't explain the grammar, you just know this is wrong or this is right, But I did have to learn Chinese a little bit, because when we moved to Taiwan when I was 11, I was functionally illiterate. I couldn't read any kanji. Well, they're not called kanji in Chinese, but I couldn't read any kanji. I could speak and understand, but I couldn't read at all. So I was actually homeschooled for 3 years, because I couldn't actually go to normal school, quote unquote, because I couldn't read at all compared to other people at my age level. So, but my first, I think, real experience of learning a language from scratch was Japanese. In college. So at the University of Michigan, they have a requirement, at least in the liberal arts departments, where you have to learn 2 years of the foreign language in order to graduate. And a fair number of people just, I'm just going to take a placement test and then get out of it and get the credits for it. But for me, I could have done that for Chinese, as many people did. But for me, I was just like, I have an opportunity to learn a language, why not? And the one I was most interested in at the time, and well, still is, it was, Japanese, because I was already pretty much of a weeb. I always loved anime and manga growing up. One of my dreams was to be a manga artist. When I was in high school, I used to draw a lot.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I do fan art, so I guess you know that too. So yeah, Japan was a natural interest, and so they had a very good language program there at the university, including, like I said, an optional study abroad. So I took it, and that's how I got started with learning Japanese.
I was just gonna be a hype person and say that does. I mean, it does. The structure that you get in college, taking the opportunity that you have, is probably worth it, because it's really hard to get yourself to do it on your own. I mean, you need that grade.
Can confirm.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine myself being able to learn the language being self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Especially when you're like me and love to procrastinate.
Yeah.
So where would you say your language is now? And did you kind of put Japanese away after college and pick it up again when you became a fan?
Yep.
Where has Japanese played a part getting to where you are now?
So my strongest language pairs, so translators will talk about language pairs for the most part, even if they know multiple languages, just because you tend to translate between specific languages out of habit. So my strongest language pair was always Chinese and English. And even though I studied Japanese for about 3 years in college, it's been 10 years since I graduated. So I did forget a lot of it, I only really got back into it, with these translations. Before that, it had been a long time since I'd ever, used Japanese at all, because there aren't that many opportunities to use it in real life. And of course, technically, you don't,
Sure.
Babymetal is all online. You just have to have something that you're interested in enough to make you use this foreign language. Yeah. Yeah, and I didn't have anything like that until I found.
That actually sort of connects with something I was going to ask, which was whether there were other things that you translated before this, or whether this is kind of also your beginning of translation.
Mm-hmm. No. I used to translate things fairly often. So, back in the day, I was a huge fan of esports, StarCraft specifically, and that was 10 years ago. And the scene was tiny compared to what it's become now. Nowadays you have competitions all over the world with commentaries and interviews in English and other languages. But back then, for StarCraft, it was basically just Korea, and so a lot of the stuff was not localized. And so translations were an important part of the StarCraft community as well. So I did a lot of translating when I was in StarCraft. I didn't do Korean to English because I can't speak Korean, but a lot of Korean articles and interviews were translated into Chinese by the Chinese fans, and then I would take those Chinese interviews and translate those into English. So there's a game of telephone going on there. So that's actually where the whole FunnyToss nickname comes from. The toss is from Protoss. That was the nickname I used when I was playing StarCraft, and I've been using it for 10 years now.
Huh.
Yeah, so I've been translating for some time, I guess, mostly just for fun. But we obviously had assignments and stuff in school too.
And I mean, I think you mentioned you used the term localize, which I think sort of digs into one of the kind of deep philosophical questions about how this translation works, which is and so part of what I was thinking about in these terms was, in terms of things like literature and poetry and stuff like that, where there really is, there's kind of a literal sense, and then there's an effect it's supposed to have on you.
Sure.
But even in just something like conversation and an interview, there's still the question of part of what I'm thinking of is that in some of these interviews, Moa tells jokes and things like that,
sure.
or there are things where there is language play, even if it isn't crafted lyrics or whatever. And so then you have a decision to make. Do you communicate the complexity, or do you try to communicate the effect? And how do you situate that in terms of getting out of one culture and into another and that kind of stuff? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I'm sure I just asked a huge question.
Yeah. I guess I'll try to answer through the basic structure of translation versus localization, because I figured this might not necessarily be a common concept to people who aren't involved in translation, because there is a big difference, and it's more of it's not one or the other. It's kind of a sliding scale, spectrum in between the two. So I'm old enough to have observed an interesting phenomenon when it comes to Japanese, media translated into English. So here, you have a situation where the fact that it's translation of something that came from a foreign culture is intentionally visible nowadays. For a lot of manga, people want to see the original meaning to a certain extent. And so now you're seeing names that aren't westernized. In Naruto, for example, or I guess Dragon Ball, all the names are in Japanese, and there are a lot of references to Japanese mythology. They don't throw grenades at each other. They have paper bombs, But in contrast, like 90s kids like me, you know of Pikachu and Ash, and not of Pikachu and Satoshi. The name was completely localized. So dialogue, talking about onigiri rice balls was infamously replaced with donuts, right? So I think for Babymetal, because it's not, the stuff they give us tends not to be designed or tends not to be localized. It tends to be translated. So when they're conducting a Japanese interview that was never designed, for foreign artists, that the international community never would have read if it weren't for meddling people like me, they tend not to explain a lot of things. And so that makes it necessary to either do a lot of research or read between the lines. And so I think my style is when it's possible, for example, to explain some jokes or whatever organically within the text, I do so. But as you've seen, another technique is to use translator's notes. And I tend to use those when unavoidable or when I think that it's going to provide more insight into a specific text. The way someone creates material is affected by whether or not they anticipate it being basically on their audience. They're going to use a lot more inside jokes and unexplained things or obscure references if they know that their audience specifically for this interview is going to understand it.
I suppose this is a good time to bring up that you don't necessarily do all this translation and localization by yourself.
Oh, no.
You do this with a partner or collaborate quite a bit.
Exactly.
You want to introduce him and kind of what that relationship is like?
Sure, no problem. So as Paul mentioned, at the top of the podcast, I work with someone called Capable Paramedic. I have a hard time saying that every single time. From Reddit. And
me too.
Just, to clarify, he's not actually a paramedic. He says that was the automatic name that Reddit, assigned him randomly when he joined, and he just stuck with it. I thought he was a paramedic because he's online at random hours at night. I'll see him. We use Google Docs, to edit and revise our articles, and I'll see him revise me at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. all the time. So I figured, he's probably a paramedic. He's got a weird sleep schedule. But he says no, he isn't. I'm like, oh, okay.
Sure.
But yeah, so we met on Reddit, and I don't know anything about him. I knew of him because he'd posted some translations of his own. And so before I posted my first translation, which was the Mikiko Metal interview from Kadokawa, I wasn't particularly confident in my abilities because, as I said, it's been 10 years since I studied the language. So I messaged him, asking him if he was willing to look over it. And, he very graciously said yes. Yeah. So, and that's how it all began. But actually, it's not just him who starts, who helps out. I'd like to point out that there's different, a lot of work that goes into a translation. And so there's different stuff, including, scanning magazines, turning the image into text and all that. So other people in the community, like Lenser or Bateria or Shrike, they also help, to scan and to transcribe because that takes a lot of time, but you don't necessarily need to know that much Japanese in order to do it. And so when I'm done with the draft translation, I message Capable Paramedic, and then he will proofread and correct.
And it's important to mention he's Japanese. Yes. He's a native Japanese person.
He's a genuine, authentic, Japanese Babymetal fan who happens to be on the subreddit.
Japanese is his first language.
And who is very gracious about, helping us, translate it and doing some things on his own. So he's a Japanese guy who I only know online, and I literally don't know anything else, about him. It's very mysterious. But
sure.
In terms of dynamics, it's kind of like a teacher-student relationship that goes both ways. So he teaches me about Japanese that I got wrong, but it's not always that I got it wrong. Sometimes it's more of a question to figure out why did I use this word, and if I can explain it in full, sometimes he thinks, oh, okay, that was a good choice, and now he's learned an English word more accurately than before. And so in terms of interpretation of what a sentence means, I tend to follow his lead, but I will reword his explanations or sentence rewritings to be more smooth in English. So
Sure.
yeah.
And I thought it was a good time to bring him up because we were talking about localization. You know, I think it's fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that he's providing a lot of insight that other translators in the past in this community don't have because he is Japanese and able to understand the context at a level we can't.
Oh, that is very useful. Yes.
Yeah, I remember actually, you know, so you just recently made available the that translation of the sort of overview of Dada dance, you know, sort of like why it was, and
Yes.
you know, that really does kind of hammer home just how much there is behind you know, all of this stuff. I mean, like I remember we came across this with Ijime Dame Zatai, I guess, you know, and the posters and stuff like that, where it was really, that is really just a play on a anti-drug ad, you know, that was common. It was common in like the early 90s or whatever, or late 80s or whatever, you know, like whenever, you know, Kobo was conscious, basically. But it's not, you know, it otherwise wouldn't have been something that we'd have any idea about, you know, and there's a lot of stuff in Dada Dance, you know, like the woo, you know, that was in all the Japanese songs. And I guess you had said actually that it was common for you too, right? Like there was something that you knew it from.
Well, there was one specific song that was played a lot in Taiwan. It was the Two Unlimited one, you know, that happened to be used a lot on variety shows. So that Wu in particular was very familiar.
I think, you know, even if I were a master of the language, you know, that's the kind of thing that would have just gone right by me. So it is really, it's very useful to have, you know, have someone who's kind of in the context and can pick up those kind of like tangential relationships, but then also, you know, be able to work with somebody who's able to translate that into, you know, our Western thinking as well.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think that's why I like doing translations so much, partly because it always feels like you're unearthing something that was originally hidden, not really intentionally hidden, but something that wasn't available otherwise. Because that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the intent, what you're thinking of when you create some material. You know, so I think Babymetal has been criticized, you know, rightly so, for being pretty generic in their English interviews and content. You get the same answers for the most part to a lot of questions. It's very scripted, and I think that's partly due to their, you know, language barrier, but also partly because, you know, when you're answering or giving material to an international audience, you don't know what they know, and you don't know what they don't know. So you don't want to give them a reference that's just totally obscure and goes over their head. You don't want to make a joke that they're not going to appreciate. And so it tends to be very generic. And, you know, that's the criticism some people have of some, let's say, K-pop, you know, that's designed to be, when it's designed to appeal to everyone, it appeals to no one at a certain level. You know, there's less depth in there. I don't mean it appeals to no one. Obviously, K-pop's very popular, but there's no deep special references that someone who gets it will appreciate in particular. So for the Japanese language interviews, or especially the Japanese magazine interviews, let's say with Hedoban or Young Guitar, they know exactly who their readers are. Like the Dada Dance interview was a good example. There's a very specific demographic that is going to appreciate the article as well as the song very much, you know. Whereas for the rest of the world, it might be, oh, it's a cool song. All right, got it. So I think the fact that they could write an article without caring whether or not someone understood what they were saying is good, because it allows them to go, you know, fully in depth into something, and, you know, we can figure it out. But yeah.
That's super interesting, and I want to just underline and restate that point because it's something I had never considered regarding how they give and present themselves in English to an international audience. That one of the reasons, or a possible contributing factor to why it's the same answers over and over again, is not just language barrier, but a contextual barrier.
Right.
And not wanting to make a reference or a joke or allude to something that nobody's going to understand because they don't have the Japanese context. I think that's super interesting. I had never considered that before.
Right, yeah. I mean, for example, let's say some examples of things I can think of that are absolutely common knowledge in Japanese culture or even some Asian cultures, but that don't make any sense at all, let's say in the West, would be, let's say, zodiac signs, you know, year of the oxen, year of the rabbit, and what those mean for your personality, or blood types. You know, there's a belief in Japan and other countries that blood type influences personality. And let's say, I can easily see an example, let's say in Sakura Gakuin, and someone talks about, oh, so and so doesn't get along with so and so. Oh, she's blood type this, I'm blood type that, or whatever, kind of half jokingly.
Right.
And you're never going to say something like that in an international interview because people are not going to understand what the hell what the hell that means,
Right.
So you'll avoid things like that that are cultural reference. That are culturally based, or let's say some of the expectations. Well, what does Yamato Nadeshiko in Make Tsune mean? What is the ideal Japanese woman? You can translate the phrase "ideal Japanese woman," but the image in your head of what that woman looks like, there's so much of that in Japan. Whether from other media or movies or wherever, right. But you can't really explain that very well without spending a lot of time on it. So they tend to avoid these things. I found in their English language stuff. Which is a shame, but understandable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, another super great reason to have a capable paramedic kind of working with you to bring out those contextual details that might otherwise be missed.
Oh, yeah,
I guess in that same vein, just because through your experience and him, do you guys ever disagree or go back and forth and just really don't know how to translate something? How do you resolve that?
I think everything that we posted thus far, there were some parts in some translations where we're like, I'm not entirely sure. Is this what it meant? And sometimes even he was like, I'm not entirely sure what it meant either. Part of it is just, translation can be difficult, and sometimes part of it is just the ambiguity of the Japanese language, and part of it is just, Koba being Koba and not being very clear about what he's saying.
Right. Sure.
But I think in general, if there's we don't really have any disagreements per se. Yeah. Because, sometimes I'm just wrong in my first draft of translation. Because, like I said, I'm not, sure. I'm really not that good at Japanese, hard as it may be to believe, And so he'll give me a correct meaning as a suggestion, but sometimes he doesn't always express the meaning very clearly. So I'll respond with something that I think might work. Like, is this what you think it says? Or wherever. And then we might revise this sentence back and forth several times. And then when he's satisfied that it works, we'll go with that. And so as long as there's nothing wrong with the meaning, he basically lets me write in whatever style that I prefer. So there's very little disagreement per se. But I think going back to how useful he's been, like as I said, I don't technically know anything about him. But my guess is basically that he's roughly the same age or older than me. I feel like he's closer to Koba in age. Like he feels like a middle-aged Japanese guy, partly because of the references and stuff that he'll talk about, or he'll know a lot of the references that Koba is talking about. Now, he could be just some, obsessed fan like us who looks up all this stuff and therefore knows it by osmosis. But I'm gathering that he is the target demographic for a lot of the whole, Koba metal stuff. So he understands a lot of the Japanese pop culture, in the 80s and 90s that are very formative for the group, and for Koba. He already knew a lot of the stuff about Dada dance and a lot of the older, I think, references that would be harder for me to understand in particular.
I remember noticing that'll be something like Dwayne Metal too.
Yes,
Dwayne Metal also is kind of like right in that area where, because he would often come up with these seemingly crazy things. It's like, oh, this whatever it was, and then phrase is some comedian's catchphrase, and so there's a particular reference.
Yeah.
But the thing is that I think now I've already forgotten where it was, but there was something in a recent translation that pretty much confirmed that was correct. that was in fact exactly where that came from.
Yeah. I think a good example is the Heroban 24 interview that you guys talked about the last episode, the Koba interview where he's talking about pro wrestling. That's an example where there were so many. I had to do so much research just to figure out what the hell was going on with that, because I didn't know anything about Japanese pro wrestling beforehand, and he talks about it as a basis for discussion and framing what he's doing with Babymetal so much that you have to understand it to figure out what he's going for. And apparently he expected the readers of Heroban to understand those references, because Japanese pro wrestling is a relatively mainstream thing, in their culture. Like all he had to say was, hey, you are so-and-so, right? Like that phrase in of itself is immediately recognizable, I think, to people.
As the unmasking in character.
Right, the unmasking and what it meant and how the theater of Japanese wrestling works. And for us, that was totally, unfamiliar. So a lot of research goes into it because I'm not necessarily in the specific target demographic. That's the pro and cons of something when you're translating something that wasn't intended for you to read.
But I would like to, sort of like emphasize that you are also bringing something to this in that, it's not just a matter of getting the, Japanese context down correctly. It's also a matter of recognizing when there are sort of unintended nuances in the English translation. Like if you were going to translate it into English, it would have a slightly different meaning or carry different implications or whatever than it would have sort of literally, so particularly with so many of these things where people are really trying to do kind of like textual analysis to figure out like what is happening. You don't want to bring in a word that carries a bunch of connotations that aren't actually in the Japanese.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that goes back to, again, understanding the target audience. Like just as they had a specific reader in mind when they do a magazine interview with Young Guitar, I also have to have a specific audience in mind when I'm doing a translation. Because again, if you don't have someone in mind, you might just be too generic, or you have to over-explain or under-explain. And I don't think that's good. So for us, because that affects how much like editorializing a translator should be doing, right? Predominantly, the idea is that you shouldn't be adding stuff that wasn't in the original text. But to me, that's not necessarily a 100% rule that can't be broken. So, like if I got a job at Metal Hammer to translate an interview, for example, I know who my target audience is and what references they might be familiar with and what might need explaining. But because I post my translations in mostly, Babymetal communities like Reddit and Facebook groups, I can assume that most people reading them are already pretty deep down the foxhole, like I am. So I don't need to explain things like the Trilogy of Lights, or when the original text literally just says bones. I know that I can safely translate it as baby bones because that's the term the fan base uses. But like I said, however, while the original Japanese audience might not need any explanation, when Koba's talking about some random TV show from the 90s, the international audience might have absolutely no idea what he's talking about. And so when it comes to target audience, there are some nuances definitely in English that you can't just directly translate. A example I have is from the Dada Dance article. They were talking about Tremaine Hawkins' woo voice that was used as a sample. The writer used a word that can mean like sexy, but Cable Paramedic, he told me that it would be better translated literally as wild or hysteric, something that works people up. But I wanted to avoid using those words specifically since he was talking about a black woman's voice. And historically, there's been more of a negative stereotype of black people being, more animalistic. And those kind of words will evoke this kind of interpretation. Now, that wasn't a problem for a Japanese magazine for Japanese readers, but I'm translating this for international readers, and they could easily get the wrong idea. So we avoided using the literal translation. And some might say this is the wrong thing to do, but I've stayed pretty consistent in believing that when doing these kinds of magazine translations, you should translate intent more than words. Though, of course, everything starts from the words. And so that's always why there's never such a thing as a perfect translation.
Right. I think this is a good time to ask about trust.
Okay.
And if you consider or think about kind of the responsibility you've taken on being a translator in this community, because essentially all of us that don't speak fluent Japanese are enough to carry a conversation or read this content. We're really just taking you and the other translators for your word. I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts on having to deal with that are.
Yeah. Given that most people, are unable to read Japanese, it's quite likely that the only exposure they have with these interviews will be from what we provide. And even if it's unofficial and done for free, there is a sense of pressure to make sure things are correct and not to spread information, out of love and respect for the group. And that's why I'm taking full advantage of the fact that someone like, Capable Paramedic is willing to proofread and edit with me. I think I'm personally capable of releasing a 80% accurate translation, let's say by myself, pretty quickly. But I prefer to have one that I'm 99% happy with, even if it means releasing it maybe 2 or 3 weeks later to give us time to translate or for me to wait for him to revise it, based on his schedule.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think, the way I address the issue of trust, because I do believe that's the case. People trust these translations and they're going to, I've seen people, take screen caps and then, share it all over Facebook. I'm like, what if I got it wrong? And I did get it wrong once, and that was kind of awkward. But that's why I have him go through every single one, even though I could probably just translate it and post them myself in a Karma Grab to be faster. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think so. One thing that you do in those translations, which I think helps with this, is that you've chosen to present it in a way where you actually give the Japanese, and then you give your translation of it, and then you have translators notes sometimes. But the Japanese text is there, and which I actually find really helpful, because even though I largely can't read it, it is I do like to be able to, if I find something that kind of jumps out at me in the translation, I kind of like to be able to go back and find it in the Japanese and see what Google did with it, see what DeepL does with it, see if I can see like what writing system it's in. Is it in katakana, or is it kanji, or like what, like I think that's useful, and it also, I think it allows people to trust you more, I would think, because you've got right there, you're just saying like this is where it came from. If you disagree, feel free to do it again.
I think that's an interesting point, because you're right, it's not very commonly done, especially for fan translations. Well, actually, for any translation in general, you don't have both put together. I think there are several reasons for it. The first is, when I first started doing it, part of it is just that I was less confident in my translations. So I wanted to avoid the sense of me, my translation being the quote unquote authority, because I could very easily be wrong. And so I wanted the original source material to be there, so someone that understood the passage could make correction. And in fact, that's actually how we got started. Killful Paramedic, he saw some things that were wrong with the Mikiko Metal interview, which he could see because, you could compare it with the original text. And then, he pointed it out to me. And I thought that was good. I wanted people to correct me, when I was wrong, and they could only do that if they had the original text, with them. So part of it is just, well, I want people to correct me because I'm not confident in myself. And that's kind of how it started. But part of it also is just that it helps to, I don't know if it works this way, but it helps to create the impression that I'm not infallible, or that translation is not infallible. There are different ways to interpret a sentence, So when you have the original material there, especially when there's something that seems weird, or sometimes in an interview there'll be some sentences that feel particularly strong or memorable. And whenever I see something like that, that's the time when I want to go back and see the original source material, just to make sure that it was translated correctly before I start spreading the word that Yui's going to come back or whatever, right? Like, yeah. So, for example, I think in some interviews when, let's say, Sue talks about, Shine, a starlight, and Yui or something like that, like the way DeepL writes it and the way I write it might be, very different. I'm like, so when I see something that seems weird or out of character or even in character, but it seems like a bombshell, I want to go and see the original source just to make sure it's correct, as opposed to someone's over-interpreting something. So by putting the original text next to it, it gives people the opportunity to do that, more easily. I'm not sure how often people take advantage of this opportunity, but it's there. Yeah.
I do. I mean, I definitely appreciate it, and I think anyone who at least has ambitions to learn Japanese and knows a little probably does.
Yeah, as somebody trying to do that, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, because I think one reason why I did that is because it's related to how I started getting translating for this community. So I don't think I actually talked about how I got started. So how it got started is, basically for the first, I think, 7 or 8 months of my time as part of the one, I just watch YouTube videos. I post on the BM servers and whatever with people. But then Lenzer, he actually scanned an OCR, the 10th anniversary, Kalakawa interview, and like everyone else, I just took it and threw it into DeepL to see if I could at least get something out of it. And then I realized, wow, machines have gotten so much better translation. You couldn't really do this back in the day with Google Translate, which is basically unusable for anything longer than a sentence. So I was pretty happy. I was thinking, I can read Japanese interviews now. Awesome. But then I started to look closer at the machine translation, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, that's wrong. Hey, wait, DeepL just completely skipped the sentence. Whoa. DeepL just added a pronoun there that did not exist, and that changes the meaning completely, because Japanese language, for people who don't know, it loves to omit pronouns which you need to figure out through context. And I thought, well, that's wrong. And I'd hate for people to get wrong information, especially from such an important 10th anniversary book. Next thing you know, people are going to start talking about how Moa secretly hates Yui or something, based on a mistranslation. And so even though my Japanese is pretty bad, but I know I can at least do better than that. So I took it upon myself to translate the Hikometal interview, because that was the one that hadn't gotten OCR'd yet. And I wanted to do something new that not everyone had read before. And that's how the whole thing started. So basically, based on the fact that I was able to compare the machine translation with the source, that's what told me that something was off. And that's what told me that, okay, being able to look at the source material is very useful for certain people. And so I just kept the habit.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. I guess maybe an interesting sidebar real quick. Who do you think has the best machine translation? Google, DeepL, Bing, anything else out there?
I mean, I'm only familiar with Google and DeepL. I know Microsoft has one translation that I've heard is pretty good, but I haven't really looked into the differences between each one. But if we're comparing DeepL and Google, there's absolutely no comparison when it comes to at least entire paragraphs. DeepL is so much better. But it skips sentences for some reason, and it adds pronouns, which Google will do as well, just because it's got to add something in order for it to work grammatically in English. But it sometimes guesses incorrectly.
Sure. And so I guess while we're on the topic of languages and translation versus machine learning and things like that, one thing you don't do is translate lyrics. And I think it might be interesting for people to know why. Why don't you do lyrics?
Well, the short answer is that my Japanese is bad. No, so I haven't actually done lyric translations, as you say, precisely because it's very different most of the time from normal spoken Japanese, especially when it comes to their earlier songs that are filled with a lot of double meanings and hidden imagery, as explored wonderfully by Professor Hartley's analysis series. So basically, think of it how translating lyrics is different from translating a conversation, even in English. However, you take it up further a notch because the potential for puns is even stronger in the Japanese language because there are fewer sounds in Japanese than in English. So a word with multiple meanings, that shares the same pronunciation is even more common in Japanese. And, Koba just goes wild with it.
Yeah,
right.
So basically, the short story is partly the lyrics have already been translated for the most part. Metal has already done an excellent job on his blog. Yeah. And the ones that aren't officially on Metal Galaxy, there really isn't that much to translate, at least as far as I can tell. The words for lyrics tend to be fairly straightforward. So there just hasn't been a need yet. But, for the fourth album, there may very well be a need for this. And assuming no one else steps up, I might have to, to try it. We'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. It hadn't occurred to me that I don't really know the translations of the Metal Galaxy songs. I mean, I'm always looking up the earlier ones for some reference or whatever. And I go to Do Metal's blog, and I knew at some conscious level that Metal Galaxy was not represented there. But yeah, that's interesting. So there really isn't a sort of canonical source,
right,
for English translations of those.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Most of the Metal Galaxy song lyrics are pretty straightforward. Yeah.
And I guess right, Omajanai just translates itself basically. So
yeah.
But I do think that and we did get some sense of this, I think, already in the Dado Dance article. But I mean, that there's some complexity in there.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, for example, the lyrics in BMC may very well feel random, but they might not actually be random. There might just be stuff that we don't know or understand. The cultural references behind it, or cultural hip hop, Japanese hip hop specifically, that no one else knows about. But I don't know it yet. Yeah.
Another thing I noticed I don't think you've done is subtitling, and I was wondering if that's just because it's a crap ton of work to sync subtitles to content, or if there was another reason why you hadn't done any subtitling. I guess
also that sort of relates to the question of doing translations of audio material as well.
Yes. So right. I guess technically it's not correct to say I haven't done any subtitling because, when desperate enough, I will do it, as evidenced by I did help translate the whole Babymetal Chronicles video. So But yeah, generally I don't do
Right.
it because so the good part about learning Japanese is that there are relatively few sounds, so pronunciation is very easy to learn. The bad part is that a lot of words share the same sound, which isn't a problem when you're reading because you have kanji to
Right.
explain the meaning very clearly. But when listening, there's nothing to work off of. You just have to know the word, and it's harder to guess or look it up. And also, the spoken word tends to be more conversational with more usage of slang compared to written interview. So it's more likely that there will be something that I've literally never heard of before, or something that's not easy to look up in an online dictionary. So the answer to this is, yeah, I don't really do subtitles, partly because it is a lot of work. Syncing. There's a lot of non-translation related busy work. That's syncing subtitles and doing the text and putting them in the right position and getting the timing right. So part of it is that I'm lazy, but part of it it's just that it's a different skill. I think interpretation, live interpretation, translating, subtitles, all are different skills within the overall umbrella of translation. And just because someone is good at one might not mean he's good at the other one.
Interesting. Have you taken a stab at doing, I know you mentioned doing StarCraft from Korean to Mandarin to English. Have you taken a stab at translating any other Japanese content since you've gotten back into language learning and working with Babymetal content?
Not really. Partly just because, like I said, my Japanese isn't that good, so it takes a lot of effort, actually, to translate. Sure. And so, as I said, I'm lazy, so I'm only going to translate something that I really love, And so I love Babymetal enough that I want to do this, but I'm not going to go and translate something that for something that I don't care about. So yeah, I haven't really taken the opportunity to go and translate something. Like I can read stuff in Japanese, more easily now than I could 6 months ago, because my Japanese has slowly improved as I've gotten back into it and shaken off the rust. But yeah, I have to care enough about it to translate it, and so far only Babymetal does that. Yeah.
I guess I was wondering if you have a sense of how translating Babymetal content relates to other material, because at least in the English presentation of their lore, their discography, things like that, there's a lot of reading in between the lines, even in English. And I guess what I was wondering is translating Babymetal stuff maybe more difficult? Is it, about the same? And that's not really just understanding the language, that's interpreting the message behind the language.
Good question. So as I said before, I haven't really translated much Japanese stuff. Any translation work I did before in Japanese was for school assignments, which is often literary, books and stuff like that to practice, And I think interviews in general are easier to translate, especially because it's mostly been, teenagers speaking, who tend not to use nearly as many, metaphors or abstract concepts compared to adults. Teens are more straightforward. And for me, Koba interviews are noticeably harder to translate than the girls. There's actually a Mikio interview from 2016 that I tried to translate that I just can't do yet. I might have to come back in a year to do it because it's just too hard for me. There's too much. So in a sense, though, it's easier to translate for Babymetal because I understand a lot of the unspoken subtext or stories that they insinuate but don't fully explain, because I'm already deep in the cult and I know a lot of things that they talk about that they don't bother explaining fully in detail because, like I said, they already know the readers are fans, so they don't have to explain it. They can just hint at it and move on to the next thing. So I guess it's easier to translate their stuff because I'm a fan.
Sure. You know the lore.
And that's actually, I think, I've often thought, I'm not sure I have good evidence for this, but I've often thought that, if you really want to learn a language, the way you want to do it is to find something that you really want to, in that language that you really want to consume,
Oh, exactly. At the risk of taking this way off topic, well, not really, but, why not? You can edit this out later. So something that really struck me, because when I was 10 years ago or something like that, I was in the UK for a conference or something like that. And there were kids, it was like an educational conference relating to democratic education. But the point is, there were kids from all over the world there. And there were kids, from Germany, from Japan, from Taiwan, from other parts of Europe and stuff like that. And something that struck me very much is that a lot of the European kids, the German kids and wherever, their English was excellent, And as we know, they learn English since for years and years in East Asia, in Japan and Korea and Taiwan. We learn English ever since elementary school, and we still suck at it. and so why is that? I wondered why that is. And something that my hypothesis is the language of entertainment is extremely important. It makes it so much easier to learn a language when you're enjoying yourself doing so, or to learn it by having fun. So, for example, Japan's a big enough market that there's a lot of stuff localized or created specifically for them. There's so much Japanese language entertainment that Japanese kids can immerse themselves in it and never, in their own Japanese language bubble. But for the smaller market, like Germany or like Sweden or wherever, like you're not going to get a Swedish translation or a Swedish release of Metal Gear Solid, something like, or whatever, a video game when kids were growing up. Like so many people I talked to, they learned English by playing games or watching, English language movies that there's no Swedish dub, there's no Swedish subtitles. You have to figure it out yourself. And because they enjoyed this stuff, they were willing to learn English in order to do it.
Sure.
So the language that you use to have fun, I think, really influences how well you learn the language. And unfortunately, for a lot of Japanese people, there's too much fun stuff in Japanese that they don't bother to learn fun stuff in English. And so the English sucks. And so thankfully for me, the fun stuff in Japanese is Babymetal. And so that motivates me to learn and continue. And I think that's a good rule of thumb for anyone seeking to learn a language. Learn it through something that you really enjoy. And of course, academic learning and going by the book and textbooks are important, but you improve a lot faster when you're doing it not just in school, when you're doing it in your own free time because you enjoy the material.
Yeah, definitely. Every time I watch something in Japanese that I'm really interested in, I'm like, okay, I can get about 15% of this, and I'm extra motivated for at least the next couple of days to get in the books. Open the apps and start studying again. So yeah, I can definitely speak to that being important.
Yeah. So no, you gotta have fun. It helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess generally speaking, is there anything out there for fans you wish fans understood about Babymetal that they might not because they don't understand the language?
I don't think this is more about the language per se. I think this is more of the whole, they're a Japanese group thing,
Yeah.
That they do things differently, partly just because, this is not just Babymetal. Japan does things their own way, partly because they have a large enough, you can call it ethnocentrism or wherever, or that they have a large enough domestic market that they can cater to the Japanese market and survive very well. So Japanese bands, in comparison to bands from, let's say, smaller countries like Korea is an example of, a country that has internationalized its entertainment industry to the entire world. Because if they only relied upon Korean customers and Korean tastes and catering to the Korean audience, their industry might be tiny because there's not enough people to support it. And so they have to cater to the world. But Japan's got, several hundred million people who are also notably willing to spend. They're not cheap. And so that creates a different kind of creative producer, because you work with the market that you have. And so a lot of things that I think people complain about when it comes to Babymetal, or they wish that they do things this way or wish they didn't do things that way, I wish people would understand that it's not necessarily unique to them. It's more of a quirk of how the Japanese entertainment industry works. Now, there are definitely problems with that, of course, but I feel like when people when they compare, Bandmate does this or so-and-so band does that, I'm like, okay, that's great, and I wish people would do that too. But you should know that Bandmate is the exception as opposed to the norm.
Right.
When it comes to this specific kind of marketing or whatever. So
even if they're compared to sort of like Western groups, they tend to be sort of look more normal.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Bandmate goes very Western style in how they present themselves, with the exception of the maid outfits.
Right. Some bands definitely are already they're changing. Even within the Japanese media industry, there is change. It's just very slow.
Yeah.
And so I guess there's one thing that I'd wish that fans of BM would understand more clearly. Especially, I think, I don't want to call anyone out here, but I think younger fans in particular who are more familiar with, let's say, K-pop or other groups that are more international oriented, like they're used to that. But that takes effort. It's not easy to do. Like, all props to K-pop for doing what they do, but a lot people who are used to that, they'll see that things that Babymetal does or doesn't do, they'll see that as intentional.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I'm like, no, I don't think that was intended to piss you off, or I don't think that was intended to be like, screw
Right.
foreigners. That's just them being them. It's not like, I'm sorry that you were hurt, but it's not personal. Yeah, that's not an excuse, But yeah.
The analogy that always comes to mind when I see stuff like that is Japan is so adverse to change, they still use fax machines in their day-to-day business operations.
And not just for the medical stuff.
Right.
Oh, yeah. No.
Change
Japan,
is glacial.
Yeah.
They love the status quo, and change is glacial.
Yes. So my company, we make my real life job, because I don't make money off translation, obviously. My real life job is we make medical measurement equipment. And for developed markets like Germany and Japan in particular, like, they want very specific things. They do not like revolutionary new products. They like innovation. They like something that slightly improves upon the current process, and then they get used to that thing, and then they want something that improves on that a little bit more. Whereas some countries, they want to go straight from landlines to cell phones, right? But Japan's going to be like, no, I want to go from landlines to this, to this, to this. They want to slightly improve it each time. So it's a very different way to look at things.
I want to go from 28K to 56K to ISDN to DSL.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's even still true now that like DVDs, actual 480p DVDs are still, made in common and stuff like that. And it's relatively hard to find Blu-ray versions of things. And that's crazy.
And a lot of those DVDs are still region locked to Asia. Like, you have to have an Asian player.
Uh-huh.
I actually found this, and this isn't a Babymetal example, but it was another group. I bought a DVD from them and went to rip it, and I had to switch the region on my computer's Blu-ray reader to rip the DVD.
Yeah. So I think there's the pros and cons, of having a very established market. The pro is that you can survive doing a lot of things, but the con is that you're not willing or unable to take bigger risks or more dramatic changes to a certain extent because you have more to lose.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose actually you could view what they're doing as they're primarily just a domestic group that is trying out being international rather than being an international group.
Yes, I think that's a very good way to describe it.
Accidentally made it big in the West.
Yeah.
Or to put it as Moa put it, why do people love Babymetal? I want to know myself. They don't actually know why they've succeeded to the certain extent that they have internationally. They're happy for it, but they don't actually know how to market internationally because that was never really their goal. It wasn't a target. It's just something that kind of happened because of how awesome they are, and they're still trying to figure out how it works. And they change. And I think they're trying. They're definitely trying. Yeah. It's just slow. The live stream this time is a market improvement over, let's say, Rock Mekan, for example.
Absolutely.
But no, just being able to view the entire thing in context of it being Japan, I think that helps to temper expectations and just to not take things so personally as an insult to you as a fan base.
Well, and just remember, Japan hates change, and if you want change, it's probably going to happen. It's just going to take way longer than a Western market.
Oh yeah.
And I think you see that over the last 10 years of existence, just kind of the glacial pace in which they have evolved their brand internationally.
Yeah, for sure.
And that they didn't expect to.
No, right? Not at all.
So we do have a question from chat. Xbook asked, do you go the other way and help translate English articles or content into Japanese for the Japanese fans?
So short answer is no. Longer answer is, so in translation, generally, even though you have a language pair, most translators will only translate in one direction. And it's almost always, you always translate into your native language. Because even if you can understand the other language, you might not be able to write effectively or accurately in that language. So for me, I almost always translate from Chinese into English or from Japanese into English. At this point, I can translate from English to Chinese fairly well, but that's because my Chinese has gotten almost to native level. But basically, you always translate into your native language, and that's how it works. Because there's significant difference between reading something and being able to write it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if there is. So I mean, like, in this particular fan base, I'm not sure that there would be that much of this going from English to Japanese. I mean, we've heard a little bit about occasionally someone who would look at Reddit or look at Discord or and sort of try to gauge what the Western response is by translating English stuff.
Babymetal is a notable example, right? They translate our ship posts into Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
But I could see, like you might be well positioned for somebody, somebody who wanted to do this seriously. If there was really something that was in English, say the graphic novel that people in Japanese might want in Japanese, you could serve in the capable paramedic role, right? In principle, if someone wanted to go that direction, you could help in the translation, but from the other side.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, I could help explain what the English meant, but I'd say that capable paramedic's English is better than my Japanese. In other words, I can't. He can suggest like English translations for how this should mean, and then I can understand it well enough to reword it to be smooth. But I cannot suggest a Japanese wording for something to someone who's trying to translate it.
Yeah.
I can tell them exactly what it means in English, but I can't give them suggestions for how it seems, or if they give me a translation, if it seems weird or not. My Japanese just isn't at that level yet. Basically, I'm kind of here because no one else was doing it, and not because I'm good at it.
Yeah. Do you guys communicate with each other in Japanese or English? Mix of both?
Oh, almost 100% in English.
Okay. Do you have any advice for people who might want to get into translation or start a language learning journey of their own?
I mean, I'd say, you just got to go for it and don't worry about making mistakes. As I said earlier, like Japanese people are famous or infamous for learning English all their lives and still being terrible at it.
Yeah.
Because they never use it in real life because they're afraid of making mistakes. And I'm just like, that's not how you learn a language, man. You just got to go with it and make mistakes and figure it out, And so, it's not some kind of, people would say, oh, I can't learn another language, or it's so hard, or you're so good at it. I'm like, no, that's just practice, Yeah. So you just got to try it and don't worry about, making mistakes, because people are going to make mistakes. I make mistakes too. You just don't see it because we already handle it and fix it and revise it before I post it publicly.
Sure.
And actually, I did want to mention that I think we're seeing a little bit of an expansion of the sort of set of people who are doing translations too. So we have the person who goes by the name Sappy Syrup has done a couple recently. And looks like there will be more as well, and so that's also great. So that all the burden is not entirely on you, for one thing.
I mean, ideally, I just sit back and wait for people to do it, and I just enjoy reading it. But unfortunately, that's not how it is. So
Sure.
Yeah.
But we definitely we hugely appreciate what you're doing. We appreciate the other ones that are coming out as well.
Yeah.
It's helped us understand the context a lot.
A lot. Yeah,
sure.
I'm sure it's helped you a lot, to understand it. But you have allowed us to understand it with you, so that's very good.
It is definitely bringing a lot back, or from my days studying, translation as a theory and language and stuff like that. Honestly, there's a lot of stuff that I've learned, I think, in translating, or it helps to bring things, concepts into life by actually doing. So for example, I think we actually kind of went to this, but I didn't really fully address it earlier on. Is that difference in styles between translators, or disagreements between, let's say, me and capable paramedic, or with other translators? So there always is some of that, and like I said, there's no perfect translation because you're always just trying to find a balance. So my style generally is I try to understand the original meaning and intent of the text, and then I write the sentence as if it weren't a translation, purely as an editor. And sometimes I might take it too far and stray from the original intent of the sentence, but I think it generally works. So a good example of literal translation versus intent is, let's say there's a movie I saw recently where a child asks an adult who is acting condescendingly to them, like, do you think I'm 5 or something? Like in Chinese, there's a phrase with almost identical intent and meaning, but the set phrase age used in it is 3. Not 5. So a literal translation would stay with 5. But 3, like, do you think I'm a 3-year-old, would be a lot more natural to the Chinese-speaking audience. and the intent expressed by the sentence is the same as the original. So do you use 3 or 5 in here? So this is a more extreme example of a time where not sticking too close to the original word might actually help a reader understand the meaning. Whereas for Keel Kerametic, he says that, well, he understands why I do things this way. I'm not entirely as a translator, but partly as an editor. Whereas for him, his style is he prefers to express his translations, because he also does some by himself, as if a non-native English speaker is struggling to express their thoughts and sentiments in English, so as their unfamiliar language. So his intention is to make sure the readers can feel a bit of discomfort or oddity and notice that there's another way of thinking or expressing than theirs. So it's for him, he tries to make it more obvious, or at least he doesn't try to hide the fact that it's Japanese girls saying this sentence. And if it doesn't feel smooth, that's good, because these are not American girls speaking English, despite he doesn't try to hide the fact. Whereas for me, I try to make it read as if it's, an American star saying something. So there's a difference in style because of that. He tends to be slightly more literal in the way he translates. You can find some of his stuff posted on Reddit as well. And whereas mine tends to be much more smoothed out, for better and for worse.
Right. Localized, you might say.
That is interesting.
I think so, yeah.
It hadn't occurred to me, like, the way you sort of stated capable paramedics idea is that it's still leaving some of the Japaneseness in there.
Yes.
Even if it didn't have to be clumsy, it's still retaining the effect that it's not English. It's not born English.
Right. Or the fact that, it might be unsmooth to English ears is specifically because Japanese people express this thing in a different way. Like I don't think about these things the same way that you do. And so therefore you're going to think it's odd when you read it. And that's perfectly fine. Like that's the way, he sees it. And in some cases I agree with that. In some places I feel, I think I.
Yeah. It still comes down to the question of, like, are you trying to recreate the experience that the Japanese have reading that interview? Or are you trying to, like, what is it that you're trying to recreate?
Yes.
If you're trying to recreate the meaning, then yeah. So. Well,
that goes into a, and feel free to cut me off if you guys are short on time, wherever. But or this just might be the translation segment.
No, go for it.
So that goes. What Paul was saying goes into the whole. There's a lot of technical concepts in translation. So the one that you're talking about is the whole invisible translator concept. So the ironic part about translation is that the more invisible the translator attempts to become, the more the original author's voice is lost. Like a literal word-for-word translation is like really clunky, awkward, and probably grammatically incorrect. And that's not the feeling that the original audience got at all when reading the text.
Right.
So obviously this is extreme, but it goes to show that a translator must, to a certain extent, reword things so it makes sense. So to be good, you actually have to really understand the original text and then create a new voice for the author. Something that's your own style, because what I try to do is recreate the feeling that the Japanese readers of the magazine got when they read the magazine, as much as possible, and sometimes there are very creative tools or ways to do that, So an interesting example that I've seen, there's a manga called Azumanga Daioh, and in the manga there's a character from Osaka. And the stereotype is that people from that area, the Kansai area, all speak in the Kansai Ben, also the case in Kyoto. Essentially, it's different from standard Tokyo-style Japanese that most people learn. And so she supposedly speaks in a slightly different dialect. And in the English anime adaptation, what they do is they give her somewhat of a Boston accent, which doesn't fit perfectly, in my opinion, but the spirit of it makes sense. I think it was chosen because it's not as subtle or hard to notice as an American Midwestern or West Coast accent, but it's not nearly as heavy as a Southern drawl. So I think this is a good example of creativity and translation that helps to preserve the original intent of the author. Or, on a related note, it's also interesting that a lot of Japanese songs, Babymetal included, will use English words in them. Sometimes randomly, sometimes making sense in the context of the song. Now, I think what's really fascinating is that at a certain level, the English that's used in these songs is its own language. Rather, it seems like more of an expansion of the Japanese vocabulary, despite being ostensibly in English. This is because the word can mean something to Japanese people, and yet something else to native English speakers. So when it comes to translating Japanese lyrics to other languages, what do? let's say you want to translate a song from Japanese into English, and there are English lyrics or words in the song. If you just directly bring the English over, then something inevitably missing because the context and feeling is different. So to repeat the point, the very feeling of seeing an English word in the middle of a Japanese song must be preserved. So for example, let's say you might translate that English word into a French word to retain the original sense and intention of the song, the exoticness of English as it's perceived by Japanese people, So there's a lot of different things that you can do depending on what your goal is, whether it is to create the feeling or to translate literally. If it's literally, then just keep the English as it is. Oh, great, pre-translated, awesome.
This reminds me somewhat of now I'm on a huge tangent, but there's something that I thought was actually super clever in an old British sitcom called LOLO, which is set in France, but it's English. Mm-hmm. Everybody's speaking English, but in the what you're supposed to believe is that they're speaking French, and so they introduce a character at some point along the way that speaks bad French. But the way that they do this is basically that they have him mispronounce all the vowels in English. Huh. He's misspeaking, but what he's misspeaking is French. Yeah. It's a great way to sort of communicate that and still let it still live in English. The whole show is incredibly dumb. It's very funny, but it's incredibly dumb. But that was I thought a very clever thing they did.
No, there's a lot of creativity and stuff that definitely goes into translation. And like I said before, there's no such thing as perfect translation. And also, what's suitable changes, with time. For let's say what might have worked now, what works now might not have worked, 20 years ago when people were less familiar with Japan in general. So I guess as another example that I find often is that Babymetal, they use the word san a lot when talking to people. And so, but do you translate that or not? I used to do it. And then I'm trying to, because if you leave it untranslated, that seems kind of weird. But if everyone reading it already knows what san means, maybe it's better to just keep it untranslated as opposed to translate it to Mr., And so sometimes there are these things that I'm still trying to figure out myself. Like as an honorific, let's say san basically adds respect, but you can also use it for non-human things. And sometimes it can imply a feel of keeping a respectful distance to something. So something on a random note is I always found that the younger girls in Sakura Gakuin referring to Suzuka as Su-chan during the SG days to be a very interesting illustration. Yeah. It's not really appropriate to call her Su-san, even though she's older, because that creates a sense of distance that they might not want. But going with Su directly without anything else might seem too casual and too intimate. And so they use Su-chan, even though normally it's a diminutive usage. And so how do you translate these things? And sometimes you can't. Yeah. And sometimes you just assume that, Japanese pop culture is pervasive enough that everyone knows what chan and san means, so I'm just going to leave it untranslated. And that works. That works now, but it might not have worked 20 years ago. Well, so for example, let's say when they talked about, Rob Halford, they always say Rob-san. And so, well, if they wanted to be more formal, they might say Halford-san, Mr. Halford, right? Right. But they say Rob-san. They use his first name plus a san, which is kind of a weird mix, right? Like, are you trying to be respectful to the guy, as an elder, or are you on a first name basis with the guy? You know what I'm saying? Sure. So at first, I translate as Mr. Rob, because that helps to their kids looking up to their big daddy figure, and it's kind of awkward and clunky, partly because it is clunky. No one says first name san. It's just weird, right? But eventually, I just stuck with screw it, Mr. Rob is too weird. Yeah, I'm just going to go with Rob-san. Yeah.
I definitely get the feeling that that's known, that people understand that now, but that might just be my changing worldview.
Right, exactly. So like I said, what works now might not have worked 20 years ago and might not work 20 years from now, so translation is not a dead, thing. It's always constantly evolving and changing. That's something that they really taught us, in school about it. And I never really understood it until I actually started doing it, for myself. There's a difference between, theory and figuring it out through practice.
So what you're saying is that the 30th anniversary translations are going to possibly be different.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah.
If only because I should be much better at Japanese 20 years from now, hopefully.
So I guess I have a final question. I'm going to close on a fun one.
Okay.
You've probably read more interviews and consumed more content of that nature about Babymetal than your average fan, probably even us. So I think you have a pretty good sense of what might be fun here. If you had the opportunity to interview them, anybody, and I'm talking, you could be Moa, Sue, Koba, anybody, who would you interview and what would you ask if you had two questions?
Okay, so obviously people want to know, like, well, when's the fourth album coming out? Or, like, when's Ewing coming back or wherever, so that's kind of pointless. I think for me, what I really, like, they've already answered a lot of the questions, like, through these in-depth magazine interviews, like, how did they grow during the dark side or wherever.
Yeah.
I think for me, I just want to know, like, I just want to know a moment or a show that they really enjoyed, and why, and just talk about it. I don't want to just necessarily hear, oh, Tokyo Dome was great, but if there's something, a special moment, from the show that stuck with their minds, even now, that makes them smile when they think about it, like that's the kind of thing I'd love to know. I guess that's just more of a wanting to know them as a person. That's the kind of thing you'd ask your friend who's in a band who just pulled off something really cool. You want to see, what stuck with you or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. Which is the kind of question that would never be asked, I think, in an interview. But it's the kind of thing that I'd want to know about them,
Sure. Would you ask the question in English or Japanese?
I think by default, I'd have to ask in English because I couldn't word it very well in Japanese. Yeah. But 20 years from now, sure, I'll ask in Japanese.
Yeah, for the 30th anniversary when you're the interviewer.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Okay. So, this has been great. We've very much appreciated what you've made available to us, but it's been great talking to you today as well. Just sort of about all this stuff, and we have, we still have several of your translations to get through, and we do enjoy talking about it on the podcast because it gives us little things that we can actually sort of grab onto and talk around, and I found it very useful to not only just have access to these, but be able to sort of talk about them. So thank you for giving us content.
Absolutely.
Sure. I mean, I think at a certain level we are reaching a point of saturation, just because like we've done so much material over the past that some of the stuff is starting to overlap with each other. Which is fine because now I feel less pressure to have to translate something because like people need to know. Like most people, I think we've already translated most of the stuff that is really important at this point. And I'm partly just waiting for the Budokan interviews to come out someday, and that'll be new stuff. But otherwise, I'm kind of like, okay, I think we've done most of what needs to be done. But as I say that, I'm actually still working on a Young Guitar Budokan show report. And I think that's going to be interesting, I think, for me to think about, because show reports, I never did them before. And because I thought they were kind of pointless. But then I realized that, it's worth trying out, because I came to the conclusion that the Japanese fan base enjoys Babymetal in a very different way than we do. Most of us in the foxhole have actually watched more shows than they have on Blu-ray, because we pirate stuff like crazy, and they just watch Blu-rays. You know what I'm saying? So, like for us, we're like, why would you read a show report? That's such a waste of time. Whereas for them, for many people, reading about the Budokan is the only way that they know what happened before they buy the Blu-ray. They didn't watch, most of them, don't watch Aerometa's fan cam. They don't know that there was Moa and 4 baby foxes, They don't know about that or what the stage looked like. So they need someone to describe it professionally in a show report. And I thought, okay, well, it might be kind of pointless, but I may as well try it and see, give this to the community. I just thought it was interesting that, the Japanese fan base consumes and enjoys the band in such a different way. Like maybe they've been to more live shows, but we've actually seen more stuff than they have, So for us, it's a much more visual experience. And for them, they read about Babymetal a lot more than we do. Let's say, through interviews. So our perception of the band is different. They have a much more, I think, I hate to use the word, intellectual interpretation and understanding of the group. Whereas for us, it's much more visual and visceral. I think
that's
general.
fair.
And I'm trying to bridge the gap between that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
That'll be super interesting.
I think to go back to StarCraft for a moment,
Full circle.
the skill gap between Koreans and the rest of the world was seemingly unsurmountable, and a big part of that was just the environment. There's just so much in-depth knowledge about the game that was Korean language only, like analysis and commentary. And even though Babymetal famously says, don't think, feel, I think ironically, in a sense, the international fan base is a lot like this, The average fan that follows via YouTube videos only knows them from the performances and a few really simple scripted English interviews. And as we all know, the in-depth stuff that explores what they think is largely untranslated until now.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's a right way to enjoy the band, but I do want to reduce this gap in knowledge so international fans can appreciate Babymetal from a perspective that's closer to the Japanese if they want to.
Sure.
Feel, of course, but also think. Despite what Sue says, Sue is wrong. Go ahead and think.
Feel critically.
Right.
Yes. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I want people to be able to think and feel if they want to.
Excellent.
That's great. So where can people find you and your translations?
So generally, I will post my translations in the various Babymetal Discord servers that I'm involved in, but I also post them on my Twitter account and on several Facebook groups. But they all point towards the same source, which is I have a blog that's become a Babymetal blog nowadays. Where you can find all the translations there. I think sometime someone is going to be really surprised when they start going through my blog archives and they're reading about Moa and Yui and cute girls, and all of a sudden there's like an in-depth article about the American Navy or something like that. Like, what the hell? But it is a personal blog. It is not a Babymetal blog, despite what it's become. It is my personal blog, and my stuff can be found there. And then I also do fan art. I also post my fan art on Twitter and on my DeviantArt. People can find it if they're interested in my post links.
Okay. And we'll definitely include links to it.
And I will say you can throw a little bit of money his way. You can buy him a pizza via his blog. I definitely encourage you, if you are able to do that. Show your thanks for all the hard work he's doing.
Yep, indeed.
Oh, yeah. No, I bought the Young Guitar, magazine interview. I think at least the pricing for magazines in Taiwan is not too outrageous because, they import them directly, so you don't have to pay for all the shipping. It just takes a lot longer because, for example, Metal Hammer, the English one that looks great, it's not available here yet. So I'm like, I'm going to wait.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And for all the hard work you and all the translator community does.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I think it's kind of surreal, to be here today. I can think back to, a year ago when I first joined the fan base and finding out about Babymetal and the podcast. I remember listening to episodes, Kevin talking about Legend Metal Galaxy or Kitsune Moments and or interviews with Darren about photography, and all those things help to enhance my own enjoyment of the group so much, of the community. Because I don't think, yes, Babymetal is great and the material is great, but there's only so much, it'll only go so far because they're not particularly active, right? The thing that keeps us involved and in love, with the band, despite them not doing anything, to exaggerate, is the community, So
absolutely,
it's just, it's an honor to be here, as part of the community, and I hope to continue doing so in the future.
Well, great. Thanks.
Awesome.
So I guess then that is it for this episode. You can join us on the Babymetal Podcast Discord to continue the conversation. Rating the podcast on whatever platform you listen on will help people find it, so please do that. We'll be back here in about 2 weeks. In fact, actually, just after the live stream, and we hope you'll join us then. So until then, see you.